Hello, this is Eileen Cook. Today is Monday, September 16th, and I am hosting a thing we call Book Passion. This is where I talk about a book that I really like, why I like it, and why I think it works. You are free to disagree with me, but I will challenge you on that. So tonight we are talking about The House at Riverton. So what is interesting, or that I want to point out, is I bought this book when it came out, which I think was 2008 here in Canada. It came out in 2006 in Australia, but I picked it up off the table. And the first thing or reason that I picked it up was actually the cover. So I think we sometimes talk about the importance of cover. And I was trying to figure out what it was about the cover that sucked me in. And I'm not entirely sure. I do know that I was sort of interested by the opening things where it sort of talks about a sweeping debut novel set in England between the wars. So part of it is that it was a time frame that appealed to me. So first, just a show of hands, and there'll be three options. How many people liked the book? Ooh, okay, at least a couple of us. All right. How many of you were like neutral on the book? How many people disliked the book? All right. So I'm actually going to start us off with Alyssa. Alyssa, why did you dislike the book?
So I tried several times to get into it, and it didn't pull me in. I eventually gave up at page 20 when there was a full page of setting description. A full page. And I was like, nope, this book is not for me. But I never would have picked this book up. The title didn't appeal to me. The cover didn't appeal to me. The description didn't appeal to me. The only reason I tried reading it was because of this. So I feel like it was well defined in all the aspects as, like I never would have guessed this would be something that would, it felt slow.
Now I want to go over to Jenny, who in theory should love this kind of book because this is basically the kind of book that she's writing.
Right.
And I'm curious why you didn't like it.
So, and you're right, because even at that conference in Denver, the agent who read my first 10 pages was like, oh, this feels like Kate Morton to me. And I'm like, oh. I think it's really slow for me. I don't think that there's a lot of tension. I read a review that said that it gets better at page 200. And I only made it to page 171 because it's not on audiobook.
All right. Now I'm trying to remember. Leslie, you had a thought.
It actually is an audiobook because that's what I've been listening to, but it's now called The Shifting Fog.
That's actually what it was called in Australia.
Yeah, well, I got this on Audible. I just got it.
Yeah.
And they said they've changed it now. So
I wasn't sure if it was going to be exactly the same or if there were changes. Yeah.
Yeah. It is. It should be the same.
Yeah.
Kit. Or who was it that really liked it? Natasha, why did you like it? You have to unmute yourself or we don't know.
Okay, I haven't finished it because my digital library book expired halfway through on the plane, and yesterday, and I couldn't finish it. But I loved it because I loved all of the. I actually really liked the pacing. I liked the characterization. I liked I'm sure I missed a lot of it, but like the imagery of there were three kids and there were lots of threes everywhere. And I mean, I was mostly reading for story, and unfortunately I didn't get to anywhere near the end, but I will definitely be buying it so that I can finish it. I thought it was just great. And I didn't know about her. And I heard somebody, maybe it's Lily, I'm not sure, but somebody doesn't like this author at all. So this taste. I'm already in love with her. So I'm curious to know why someone wouldn't like it. That'd be very interesting to me.
Well, and she does have a bunch of other books, and I love them all pretty much. I've read them all and love them. So I do have a bias. So Jen, you had a comment?
I think that I don't like them because of the pacing, and I think that's a personal preference. And I think years ago I might have had more tolerance for slower pacing, but I think especially since I usually listen, the other books of hers that I've tried to read, I've been listening to, and that was really slow. Like if I'm in the car and I can't even I get bored enough that I turn it off, that's bad.
You know what I find interesting is I did not find the pacing slow at all.
Either.
Leslie, your thoughts?
Well, I'm listening to it, and I'm doing things. I'm listening to it, and I don't know if that's a different experience than actually reading all the description. But I was so transported. I love the narrator and the British accents and the different voices. And I had this image of the woman, the old lady from the Titanic, looking back and telling her story, and I don't know. I'm completely immersed in it, and because I'm listening and I'm looking at it, I'm relying only on her descriptions to see the scenes and everything. And I mean, I do read everything I read. I just finished an incredible, fast-paced science fiction that I couldn't stop reading. But this is such a different experience for me. This is such a sensory experience that, I have 2 hours and 22 minutes left, and I don't really want it to be over because I feel like I've just been immersed in this world for so long. I don't want it to go. It's a lot of hours of reading. It's like, I don't know, 21 hours or something. Like it's a lot of hours of listening, but I love it. So, and I read fast-paced stuff, and I love fast-paced stuff. So it's just a very, very different experience.
Natasha, you had a comment.
There was one criticism that I had that was it's a small one, and it could have been my level of attention at the time of reading, but I felt that there were quite a few characters, and I got a little bit confused at times and had to go back as to who was who. Like Mr. Frederick and Mr. Hamilton, for some reason, confused me. There wasn't enough distinction in the way they spoke, or somehow that kept it clear enough for me.
Fair enough. Kit.
I also liked it because I really enjoyed the 98-year-old looking back. I'm also writing at this time periods in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s. So the time period is very interesting to me. But I found it a little too literary or too much description. I really enjoy reading different things, and I think it's important for me to read different genres, and I'm very happy to do so. But it wouldn't have been a book that I would have chosen, even though I like the idea of a 98-year-old looking back, and it's my time period. So, but all in all, I liked it, though. I would recommend it, especially to people who like Downton Abbey, that kind of thing.
Yes. So that was one of my questions, is how many people love Downton Abbey?
No.
Because I think if you like Downton Abbey, generally, one of the things I actually found interesting is how many plot lines show up in Downton Abbey that are in this book. And this book came out well before Downton Abbey. Which
you should get some royalties from them, because they definitely stole some plot points.
There was definitely quite a few where I was like, interesting. So I thought that was interesting. So I want to talk a little bit about why I liked it.
Can I say something?
Sure.
Can I say, sorry. I just want to put my 2 cents in. I didn't have any problem with the pacing. I think it's interesting because it did feel derivative to me, even though it was first. But having, and not just of Downton Abbey, but of Upstairs, Downstairs, that whole sort of genre of the maids, the this class and that class. And so that felt like very already done a lot. But my biggest problem with it was I knew right away what her identity, I mean, it was so obvious to me that what the main character's relationship was in that house. And it just was like, like, I don't know. It just, that really ruined it for me.
So, question, how many people figured out who Grace was?
Not until page 170.
So I think one of the things that I liked about this book is I thought there were a lot of clues left all the way along for several different things. And I don't think some things, like I'm not sure that Grace's identity was necessarily meant to be a secret. In fact, there is a line very, very early on that I think if you're reading, it's definitely the giveaway. So hang on. I made notes. I have to flip through the book. It's all tagged, you can see. Oh, not that one. Hang on. Okay, so this is when Grace first goes to the big house, the house at Riverton. And it says, she dusted her apron, pulled her round shoulders to full height, so her chest seemed even more expansive. You just be sure and tell your mother we're looking out for you up here. She shook her head. Fine girl, your mother. Guilty of nothing that ain't been done 1,000 times before. So that happens on page 52 of the book, which again, apparently if you watch Downton Abbey, right away you're like, somebody's had a baby, and she's the baby. So that was a clue for me. But I'm actually going to start at the very beginning. How many people loved Rebecca? By D'Amour. So Rebecca is one of my all-time most favorite classic books. I remember reading it in English class. The opening line of Rebecca is, last night I dreamed I went to Manderley again, which is the opening line. The opening line of this novel is, last November I had a nightmare. It was 1924 and I was at Riverton again. I do not think that is an accident by any stretch of the imagination. I think it's very much a tip of the hat to the great Gothic novel, Rebecca, that she is trying to set up. And there were a lot of, for me, similarities between Rebecca, which again, I'm freely admitting is one of my favorites, and this book, which is, in Rebecca, the entire mystery is about what happened to the original Mrs. De Winter. And what happened to her and what went on with all of that and trying to figure that out. And in the same way, this is something where you know that someone was murdered, you know what happens at this house party, you probably have some suggestions. I don't think there's too many people who were shocked at who the actual book, maybe a few people, but it was a quiet mystery that sort of moves along that way. Natasha, you have something to say.
Well, on my computer, you froze just at the moment when you were saying nobody was I missed the last little bit, and it's like, what did she say? That's why I was looking confused.
I said, nobody, I don't think too many people were surprised with who committed the murder, like who killed the poet. You're going to have a pretty good hunch, I think, going into it. So that I think was interesting. I really loved the contrasting time frames. So I think it was Bonnie who mentioned, this idea of we're starting off with this much older woman who's looking back. It also did remind me of the Titanic movie, kind of similar thing where here's a character who has survived this trauma and is now coming back to sort of tell you the story. And from a writing perspective, the use of those two different timelines allows her to release information at different times. If you went back through, which I didn't do because I didn't have enough time from rereading it, and actually blocked it out chapter by chapter, it would be really interesting to see when you found out what, when, because she is using the two different timelines to play with your expectations of that. So versus if it was reading all in the present time.
Mm-hmm.
So that is one of the things that I find particularly interesting. I think one of the things that might make it slow for some people is the fact that Grace is the main character, but the mystery, which would be the plot that in theory drives the story, she is simply an observer to that mystery. Jenny.
I think that didn't bother me as much as, like, I know there's these lingering questions out there, and I thought that she did a good job, like, planting those questions. But there's not, in the day-to-day life of the book, there's not a lot of tension. And my question was, did this story start too soon? Is it really a lot of backstory at the beginning about how Grace goes to work at the house and what the day-to-day life is like? And, it's like, 100 years ago, people could write books like that because we didn't know as much. And so it's kind of written more like a classic, whereas today, like, most people who would pick up this book are kind of familiar with that time period and what life as a servant in a wealthy household would have been like.
I do think, just in terms of I can't remember, it does read much more like a classic to me than it does read like a contemporary book. Mm-hmm. I could have easily, if you told me this book was written in 1970, I would have believed it completely. Yeah. There's really not a lot that makes me see it as a contemporary book. For people who liked Rebecca, there was an updated version of Rebecca that just came out a year or two ago. I will try and find the title of that book. But I thought it was interesting because Rebecca, again, was a very slow-paced kind of story, and the updated version was much different. Is there a comment from someone? Just my inner tubes. Lily.
I have a question about the narrator, the age. Because, coincidentally, this one, the storyteller actually is a 98-year-old woman. Then I have read a couple of other books that the narrator is a 10-year-old kid. And they describe these scenes and they remember everything. And so I'm just thinking, is that realistic, or like, I don't know really. It kind of bothers me a little bit while I'm reading it. But I may be too sensitive about it, So what's your take?
Well, I would go two different ways. So I sort of feel like there is some degree of artistic license, because it's almost like she's telling us some stories and then some chapters are actual full flashbacks. Like, I don't think she's remembering exact conversations or the kinds of things that happen in the chapters that are, kind of primarily set in the past. I have a harder time, similar to you, Lily, if there's a younger character that seems to have immense maturity and they're noticing and commenting on things that it feels like they wouldn't have the maturity to comment on that. But I didn't notice it as much with Grace. I think the tension that exists in this book, to kind of get to Jenny's point, is we often talk about whether books are plot-based or character-based. And a lot of genre is primarily plot-based. Certainly the best genres, thank you, Natasha, you found it. The Winters is the updated version of Rebecca, which I would give a thumbs up to as well. I enjoyed that book. I think, obviously really good genre fiction is both character-based and plot-based, but people who are reading genre fiction, I think, are as compared to literary fiction. And my internet is unstable. It's not me. I'm perfectly stable, but it's the internet.
I didn't know if it was my internet, because nobody else was looking as confused as I was feeling. So
they're used to just nodding along with me. Like, they're like, whatever Eileen is saying is just fine. So I want to just talk a little bit about the hints that she does in this, which I think she lays a lot of things that, for me, because I'm interested in the character of Grace, that I sort of end up following along. So we talk about Grace's mom and who she is. So I mentioned the one already, like, you know, what she did. There's nothing shamed of there. Nothing hasn't happened before. Page 234, and they're talking about him. Hardly. As you know, he's shown little interest in taking another wife. He didn't show nearly enough interest in his first wife, if you ask me. He was far too busy with, she glanced at me and I busied myself straightening the tea cloth, with that other despicable business. So again, there's this interesting thing where they're sort of layering, and it's never actually very much expressly said. And there is one more here. Certainly by the end, I feel like it's pretty out there and you know it. So she says, for example, I did wonder about that little baby Florence, my half niece, I suppose. So by that point in the story, she definitely knows who she is. But I don't believe that Grace knew the relationship when she first went to work at the house.
No,
Go ahead, Jenny.
I just read the part where her mother's like kind of talking. It's like on page 164 and 165, where she's asking a lot of questions about Mr. Frederick, and then she's all like devastated that he would think about remarrying, and she's suddenly getting money from someplace, and you know, so that's where I figured it out.
There's just some very interesting, and she lays it all the way through. So like when we also talk about the actual murder mystery, so what happened to the poet, she does a lot of things where she sort of plays things like it was just a children's game, and yet what happened at the end would surely not have come about without it. So you sort of know. So for me, I found myself, the tension was that very subtle thing between people and the secrets that they have. So you have and what happened with that, and her relationship with her husband, the relationship that Grace has with her grandson and whatever happened to him and his wife. So for me, I think it's the interest in the relationships between the two characters that drove it for me. And I don't remember what I said you have. So that for me was what drove that, and thinking about how, you know, I don't believe certainly that Hannah or her sister Emmeline knew that Grace was their stepsister. But I thought that the relationship, and again, as I think, you know, came up, the upstairs, downstairs, the very difference in their lives was just fascinating for me. And that's why I particularly liked that part. I think what I found most interesting was, for me, the theme about how lies and secrets can be so damaging. So really, the crux of this book turns on the fact that Grace doesn't actually know how to read shorthand. Right? She's lied about it. And for those of you who aren't at the very end of the book, I'm not going to give away the big part of this thing, but the fact that she doesn't know shorthand is in many ways what everything turned on in this book. And for me, that was just a really lovely epiphany, because its secrets and lies are all the way through this book. It's the lies that her mom, you know, never tells her who her dad is, that the sisters, you know, don't know that this is their stepsister. It's that Alfred isn't able to share the secret about what happened to him in the war. It's over and over, all these people who have, whether it's a deliberate lie or it's a secret that they can't share because they're afraid of what people will think of them. But by not sharing that secret, it ultimately destroys them. Mm. And the way that she resolves this is this entire book, in some ways, I think you're meant to believe, is her grandson, who has then listened to all the tapes that she has made, is now documenting all of it. And he's now releasing all the secrets out into the world. So for me, I found that fascinating. Was it Natasha that you had a comment?
Yes, I don't know how many people other than me have not finished the book. Okay, I thought maybe it was just me, but if it were just for my benefit, I wouldn't ask you to hold back.
Yeah, no, I would go ahead. I mean, I don't mind having the secret spoiled. I will finish anyway.
Yeah, me too. So I'm good.
All right. Well, if you don't want to hear, pull out your headphones at this point. So, as you may recall, Grace is keeping a secret, and she allows Hannah to think that that is a secret that they share, because Hannah is also taking shorthand classes. And so Hannah believes that Grace is also taking that shorthand class. At the very end of the book, Hannah has decided to run away with this man that she actually really loves, Robbie. So she is ready to run away with him and to, let this love. She's ready to let the secret out of the bag. But in order to get away, she knows that her current husband will follow her to the ends of the earth if she's just run away. So she writes 2 letters. She writes a suicide note, which is for her sister. And she writes a note to Grace in shorthand.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh, indeed. So the suicide note basically says, I can't live anymore. Please understand, all this kind of thing. When Grace finds both the letters, of course, she can't read the one to her, but she does open and read Emmeline's. She believes Hannah's about to kill herself. She gets Emmeline. They race to where she has gone to stop her from suicide. And in fact, she's taken off her shoes, and all these things are right by the river's edge. And they attempt to stop her. A whole bunch of things come out, and Robbie ends up dead as a result of that, because Emmeline shoots him. Later, what you find out is the shorthand says, I'm going to be faking my suicide so that we can run away. Please don't tell anyone about these notes until the morning, in which case we'll be long gone. But the fact that she can't read the note means that she ruins it. Natasha.
Well, that they talk about Romeo and Juliet throughout the whole thing. Okay, now I get it.
I do have to give a huge tip of the hat to her as a writer. So regardless if you like her writing style, which I think is just a personal thing, some people are going to like it and some people aren't. But I do have to hand it to her around dropping hints about what all these various mysteries are, and then actually stitching them all together at the end. Because what's happening in the past, like she's keeping secrets from her daughter still, there's all of that that's going. Is making a film in the present time, which is all about this, and she knows the truth of what's happened. There is the themes of Romeo and Juliet are coming through. If you like Rebecca, it's again kind of the same things. Rebecca gets ruined because he's keeping secrets about who his ex-wife really is. And so she's making all these assumptions about, the first Mr. Winter was all these wonderful things and he misses her, when basically it's the very farthest thing. But the fact that they don't have those conversations is what, in fact, ruins it for everybody. So she clearly, that's her theme that she is playing with, and it keeps coming up again and again, this idea of secrets. And if you think about the game, so the 3 kids play this game, and it's like Fight Club, first rule about the game is you don't talk about the game. So they're not allowed to sort of talk about it with anyone else. But then her brother actually shares knowledge of the game with Robbie. So then he knows things, but not everyone knows that he knows things. So there's this whole secret that because Hannah and Robbie want to get together, they're sort of using Emmeline as a in between to allow that to happen, which you just knew was going to go bad. Anyone else? Like you just... You had to know that was not going to end well. And with, Emmeline, being fully believed that, they have been in love since the whole Christmas tree incident. So she does take that theme, and Bonnie with an I, not an IE, you talked in office hours the one day about how do you get theme into all the different scenes. And I think this is a nice idea. If you looked and said that secrets and lies can be damaging, if you went back through, I bet it's pretty much in almost every scene in this book. And I didn't have that realization until I was about halfway through. Leslie, or are you just stretching your arm? Your mic's not on, so I'm going to assume you're just stretching.
Just stretching my sore wrist.
It's all that writing you guys are doing. It's a good thing. It's a beautiful thing. So I think she does do that particularly well. I think also I recognize that I don't think I could write this book where Grace is the observer, and yet I was still riveted by this mystery. Like if this had come to me, if Natasha came to me and said, I have this draft of a book and this is what I'm doing, I'm like, well, why are you telling it from, rotating points of views between the two sisters? I don't know if I would have picked Grace to be the main character, but in the end, for me, that worked really well, in part because as a result of being a servant, she is the one who observes and is in the best situation to know everything. So I'm going to go to Jenny and then over to Bonnie's comment, because I think that's useful. Jenny.
Two quick things. One is when I first started writing my Winchester story, the whole thing was from Henrietta's point of view, and it is really difficult. I had to change because I found her just sort of hanging out by the wallpaper, a lot. So I admire Kate Morton for that. And while for me the tension is really low, I can admire her writing. I think she wrote really well, and I think the way she develops the themes, like you were saying, I think she does that really well.
So, Bonnie, do you want to talk a little bit about your line, the protagonist is the one causing the action and the plot points, and whether or not you think that worked?
Well, usually we're told that the protagonist has to actively be causing things to happen. And we get the Mary Sue thing, and your protagonist isn't active. Isn't the instigator, and in this case she wasn't. But when you told me the ending, I can see how she actually caused the ending to happen, and she's reflecting on that and the steps on how it came about.
And I think that was
playing with that rule maybe a little bit.
I think she is playing with it, because I think, as I was reading the book the first time, I was always going through trying to figure out, I was pretty sure that it was either Emmeline was my first guess, which I was right, that Emmeline was the murderer, or the husband was the murderer, that he somehow had caught, or possibly that my third outlier was maybe it was Hannah got driven to something and she killed him. But Emmeline was my first guess. But I think what you come to as you come through the end of this book is that Grace has an awareness that this murder is on her. She is the guilty party. And if you read that, there's this temptation, because I know Jenny can wait for nothing more than to reread this again, is to go back through and read it again and look at if this is a lot of justification and allow me to explain.
Well, it's her guilt kind of telling the story. Like she's trying to...
A good thing.
Yeah.
So I think that's interesting. Jen also has, she's basically, as a servant, she's given up her whole life. And there's the whole scene where she actually falls in love with Alfred, and Alfred, comes and asks her to marry him. And it becomes this thing where she can't do it because it would mean having to leave her behind. And I would agree with Lily's that in literary fiction, or certainly older books, often it is the observer. So, if you look at the Sherlock Holmes, Watson is the one who narrates all of those books. He's not the one solving the crimes. He's the one kind of documenting the crimes. So there is something about a little bit of a distance. I do have to highlight, there was one line that I really loved, and I wanted to just kind of read it to you. And this is, so Hannah, plot twister, Hannah eventually dies as well in the book. And there is the line, I couldn't leave her, not like that. I retired from her bedside, but not from the room. As she lay on the bed and the doctor started to cut, I watched from the doctor and I saw her face. As she laid back her head, she breathed a sigh that looked an awful lot like release. She knew that if she didn't fight it, she could go. It would all be over. No, it wasn't a sudden death. She'd been dying for months. Maybe I'm just a little bit of a sucker about someone dying from a broken heart. But that line, like, I had underlined that back when I read it the first time, and it still for me was just this idea of love and tragedy. Then what I find interesting is who Grace becomes. So Grace is this uneducated woman who's a servant in this house. She goes through this. She gives up her love, Alfred, who, spoiler alert, again, does come back. So Alfred and she do reunite at a later time. So that does kind of come back in. But she leaves the house and then she becomes this archaeologist. And I was curious what people thought of that particular choice. Anyone? I think it's a not too subtle nod to the idea of buried secrets. That's, and I think there may even be a line, Leslie, about this idea of, archaeologists, what they do is they try and make sense of the past by digging through it again. And that's what this book is her digging through the past to make sense of it. Leslie?
Because that when the interviewer is interviewing her, she actually had that line about the past, so it seemed like a good choice.
Other people? Thoughts on that? I thought it was a very interesting choice, because obviously the idea that you want to show, which is part of this time, this huge shift in how people function and react, that, someone goes from being a servant to becoming an archaeologist. But I think the choice to make her an archaeologist versus a doctor or anything else was a very, very deliberate choice. I think everything in this book was a very deliberate choice. Jenny?
Yeah, it just reminded me what somebody said. I had a page dog-eared when Grace first goes to work at the big house, and she's talking with Mr. Hamilton, and he says, blah, 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 blah. You must do the family justice, keep their secrets, and deserve their trust.
It's everywhere. It's on all of, when you start going back through, you start seeing all of this stuff. Oh, and that's an excellent point, Jan, is that Hannah did want to be the one to travel and go to Egypt and have all this adventure. And Grace is the one that did it for her. Look at Natasha's like, yes. She's going to give you an A+ on your paper for recognizing that. And it's also that reminder that, again, they were all sisters. Whatever was inside them, whatever that was, there would have been some similarities between all the women to do that, because they all were very interesting parts of themselves. Has anyone here ever read Remains of the Day by, I'm going to screw this up, Ishiguro something? I can't remember. It's also a lovely movie starring Emma Thompson, I think. If you haven't seen
another one that's from this genre, definitely.
Yes. Thank you. Natasha, who's like my second brain, I'm like, it's a book, it's something in it. And then Natasha writes it down. Believe it or not, I did actually plan for this discussion, but there you go. But yeah, Remains of the Day is very much in the same sort of genre where you're following the head butler and the housekeeper in this relationship and what they say and don't say to each other. That's another book that I liked, but if you thought this book was quiet and slow, that one will make you want to hurl it against the wall because it is, if possible, even slower. I loved it. And the movie is also very interesting because so much is not said. And I think that was a cultural time period around where you just didn't talk about this. I mean, it is the British of that. So to me, the whole book is a bit of a stiff upper lip. And I disappeared again. So I was saying,
I think she said it is the British tradition to do that.
yes.
Yeah, okay.
The very, the kind of a little bit of a cliche, but the British tradition of, stiff upper lip. We don't talk about things. We don't deal with those things. And how admired that is by so many people. And that's seen as such a good thing. But I think what these books are talking about is the bad thing that comes from that by not having those conversations, it leads to broken heart, which is again, like you can argue it's part of the same theme. It's another example of how if you don't talk about what you're really feeling, how that can go badly. So after the war, Alfred can't talk about it. And there's a whole scene where she says, basically tell me what happens. And then he starts to tell her and she's like, don't talk about these horrible things. And then he's like, then don't ask. It's both. I think Alyssa's question about the stiff upper lip, it is around, how like when you cry, your lip quivers. I think that's partially where the saying comes from, is that you don't let emotion out. You don't let people know what you're thinking, that you stay reserved and quiet, and that you don't, get all blubbery about feelings and all those kinds of nasty, horrible things. But the lack of feelings, it causes her and Alfred to basically fall apart for a long period of time. It leads to the murder. It leads to all the other things. So secrets equal bad. That's what Kate Morton has to say about that. When we talk about backstory, this book is a great example of telling backstory by doing two different storylines. If you also liked The Orphan Train or The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna, that's another one where it's two different time frames that are giving you different pieces of information as a way of sharing backstory. Natasha. Does Kate Morton have similar themes in all of her books? I'd have to reread some of them. There's definitely similarities. In all of her books, there are two different timelines. She consistently plays with the two different timelines as a way of telling a story, which I think part of is what I like about it is I would suck at this. Like what to say, like I think in such a linear way, it would be very hard for me to have this thing where sometimes you're finding out information and other times you're not finding out information. And then you're kind of going back and forth about what those two. The pacing is slower. I did read just before this one. I don't know if anyone else reads, it's The Mistress at the Ritz is the title. And she's also she did The Aviator, Melanie Benjamin. Ha! Thank you, Natasha, before you could find it. It's Melanie Benjamin. She wrote The Aviator's Wife was one of hers, which was about Charles Lindbergh's wife. You'd love her, Natasha. She wrote Mrs. Tom Thumb, which is actually about the woman who was Tom Thumbs. Her big breakout book was called Alice I Have Been, which was about the little girl who inspired Alice in Wonderland. And if you read any of the stuff around that, there's some thought about him, the author, being a little bit of maybe a pedophile or a little bit odd with kids. So that is an interesting thing. But Melanie Benjamin writes what I would say is much more genre fiction. So the pace is much quicker. Mistress at the Ritz is all about the husband and wife couple that owned and operated the Ritz Hotel in Paris during World War II. So the hotel was the Nazi headquarters. That's what the headquarters was going out of. And the interesting thing is that both of them were involved with the resistance, both the wife and the husband, but neither of them knew that the other person was there, was doing it. So the husband thought his wife was just a flitty woman who went to all these parties. And she thought her husband just kowtowed to the Germans and did whatever they want, but they were both actually feeding the resistance information. Yes, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, the World War II version. But it's another book that you could argue is about some of the same things. So it's all about secrets that they're keeping from each other, from the Germans. I won't say some of the big things that actually come out by the end of that book about different people, but it's some of the same things. But pacing, it's much faster. There's a lot more things happening as they're very active in the resistance and trying to smuggle people out and get them out from the war and all those kinds of things. So it would be an interesting book if people wanted to read the difference. And it's called The Mistress of the Ritz by Melanie Benjamin. So it would be a different kind of combined. Yeah, I have a thing for secrets. I don't know what that is, but and it predates my current fascination with them. So it was always kind of a freestanding thing for me, which is around, and I think I'm actually, because I was working on my conflict book, was talking about values that are important to me, and honesty is one of them. And, you know, if people keep secrets or don't keep secrets. And so that is why I really liked A House at Riverton. And for those of you who didn't enjoy it, thank you for at least trying to persevere through it and try it out and see if it took your fancy. It's very different than the other book that I picked, which was a slasher thriller. So you can tell I have a wide variety of things that I enjoy reading. Jenny.
I will have to say that reading it for craft and then listening to this discussion has given me a greater appreciation for her, and I will finish the book with that greater appreciation.
If people are interested in multiple timelines, I do think this is a great example, and it would be very interesting to do my index card example, where you'd make an index card for each chapter and sort of list out, you know, this happened, this is the key information that you find out. Because how she kind of unpeels this onion is very interesting, because it would have been very easy to start with, what if this book, like if I was going to write it, because I'm not Kate Morton, I would have been tempted to open with a line like, the murder that happened at the lake house was entirely my fault, and no one knew that, not even me at the time. And then I would go back, because I would be interested to set up that idea that I'm now dealing with guilt. Yes, Codename Verity, great also book about the resistance. Nice FYI. Yeah, that Kate Morton, she's going to have to work on her craft a little. I wasn't going to say anything, but the girl's got to do what a girl's got to do. But if you did like it, I would encourage you to check out Kate Morton's other books. She did one, The Secret Garden, The Forgotten Garden, sorry. She's one of those people I buy in hardcover, so that tells you a lot. Leslie.
I just I'm listening to this, and I've just got the part in the book where I believe for the first time we've actually switched points of view, and now we're in Hannah's head. Before we were seeing everything through Grace's lens, which I found really interesting, because she's that servant, she's always kind of in the background observing everything, and then all of a sudden now, with 2 hours left, we're completely in Hannah's head, because we have to see her relationship with Robbie. And I thought that was kind of far into the book to be switching points of view. I thought that was interesting.
And it would be, again, I think a thing I would have said wouldn't have worked, and yet for me it did. Oh, interesting. So Bonnie would have gone the other way. Started with Grace as a girl. Ah, you clever minion. One of the things I always is how would I redo it if it was up to me? So that may be a thing for Jenny, for you to think about, like, if you were going to tell this mystery, and it fundamentally is a great mystery, right?
Right.
This guy, it's considered a suicide, but people kind of suspect something happened. Nobody really knows what happened. How would you tell that story? Would it be, in a linear kind of thing? Would it be from the detective's point of view? Not an old woman. If you're Lily, you're going to change that sucker out. And it doesn't have to be. Like, there would be no reason that the story couldn't be told from Grace's point of view a year after the murder.
Mm-hmm.
The fact to have that much extra distance.
Does the movie become critical to the plot at some point?
Critical. I don't know if I would say critical. The movie is definitely part of what has her reflecting on what happened. And again, looking at how it's being told from other people, what she knows. So critical, not necessarily. Yeah, there wouldn't have been as much of an arc if she told it the year after the murder, but it would have been a very different story. You could have focused much more on a murder mystery, or you could have made faster paced. Whenever you're doing backstory, I always tell people, be in mind that makes everything a little bit slower. Right? Because you already know things turned out, right? Like, as soon as you have someone reminiscing, you take out some of the tension because you know they're going to be fine. So whenever you do that, so that, that was very much a deliberate decision to do that. And I find that very interesting. Any other thoughts on Kate Morton before I set you free for the night? You could argue that, Leslie, but for some reason, I think because we're so used to reading in past tense, so the question is, isn't any story written in past tense the same? I think for some reason we almost read past tense oftentimes as present tense. Like, I feel like in the moment of the story, even though it is past tense, but as soon as a character says, I'm going to tell you about this thing that happened years ago, then I know, like, no matter what happened, everybody's fine. Or not everybody, but at least the character telling the story. Maybe reading it as immediate past, or there's something for me that it's a very seamless thing. Whereas writing in present tense feels almost like I'm falling off a cliff. Like, I feel like I'm running on an escalator and I'm about to, like, go ass over a tea kettle. Jenny.
It's not the first chapter where she has the nightmare, but the very next chapter is written in present tense. And then I don't think any of the other chapters when she's old are written that way. It's just that very first chapter.
In terms of being
in present
so reflective?
No, it's just weird that she used the present tense for that one place and then she never goes back to it. Like, I kind of expected whenever she was the old her.
Is she? She's not in present tense.
Is now on page.
Wait. Oh, sorry.
Where it starts the drawing room, like this is sort of the second chapter. My hair, always pale, is now flossy white and very, very long. It is finer too.
Okay. Yep. No, I was looking at the wrong page.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm trying to find the next place where she's talking to the young actress.
I'm flipping too. Yeah, it's present in those points. An interesting thing that I didn't even notice when I was reading it.
Yeah. I don't like that either. So I'm just wrong all over the place.
You're entitled not to like it. Bonnie, what was you going to say? I cut you off.
Sorry. Wouldn't that just be a technique of trying to pull you from the past story and show you here we are in the present?
Yeah, I think that's what she's trying to do. And again, for me, it read seamlessly. Like, I didn't even notice that jump. But when you say that, I do think I was never confused whether we were in the past or the present, And that may have been what it was as an unconscious level, is the fact that she had changed the kind of tense might have been enough to do that. So I've made one convert. Natasha's going to read her again. The rest of you will never have look at her again. That's okay.
Read again.
What I will say is I will also be thinking and pulling another book. But if someone else wants to do it, I think doing the book passion kind of thing is an interesting way. For me, I haven't reread this book since I think I read it the first time, or maybe like I might have read it right away again after reading it the first time. So it was very scary for me after I had said this was a book passion. And I still list this when people say, what's one of your favorite books? I always say The House at Riverton is one of my favorites. I thought, oh God, what if I reread it and I hate it? And I still didn't. I still really loved the book. And of like, I tagged anytime I saw her, you know, hinting at mystery, anytime she did that, if there was a line I particularly liked, so that I could go back and kind of organize my thoughts about that. So it was interesting to do that. And I very much still loved it. Natasha.
Well, I wouldn't be prepared to lead it, but one of my favorite books, if people ask me, is a book called Saturday by Ian McEwan. And one of the reasons is the allegory between first world superiority and third world or developing world problems. And it takes place on one day with this surgeon who lives in a 7,000 square foot palace in London, who is robbed during a peace march because he's diverted by this person and his cronies. This fellow has some sort of disease, and he says, "I can fix you." And it all kind of unfolds from there. And I just love that about the book.
All right, so people are putting some of their favorites in. So think about whether or not you might at some point be willing to lead a conversation on it. Or if nothing else, people pick up Saturday and let Natasha know if she's right or wrong, that it's brilliant. And The Atomic Weight of Love is one that's going down as people's favorites. And I will look through my shelf about books, and now I'm very good because I moved so many times now recently that I've been very cruel with books. And if I don't love them, they get booted. So I think there's something about a book that you decide to keep and hang on to even after you've read it, and that you still think about. Because I can think of so many books that I have where I read and then they are gone. So think about your passion.
Oh yeah, that was good.
You got a thumbs. Okay, that was good. She liked that one. All right. Well, I hope everyone has a wonderful night, and I will see some of you on Wednesday in office hours. And until then, take care, everybody.
Okay, bye.
Bye.